Hey guys, it's day 20. That means we are in Matthew chapter 20. We open up with the parable of the laborers or the workers in the field, right? Jesus starts out and says, for the kingdom of heaven. So he's telling us once again what heaven is like. And we get this parable of this master calling workers, right? He calls in the first thing in the morning, calls mid-morning, calls afternoon, calls mid-afternoon, and then calls some at evening. And when they come to get paid, he pays them all the same. And we can see here that some of the workers, they get mad because the ones that worked all day got paid the same that one that just came and worked 1 hour. And the whole point of this is we pick up in verse 16, the last verse. It says, so the last will be first and the first will be last. Now, we've heard this several times already in the book of Matthew, but once again, Jesus is telling his disciples and thus telling us that it is God's giving of rewards in heaven is not to what we deserve. It's to what he gives and what he blesses with. The disciples were struggling and they're thinking, man, I've left my job. I've left my home. I've left everything, Jesus, to follow you. And now some of these people are being converted and they're becoming followers. But Jesus, they're not with you at the very beginning. They haven't given up as much as I can. And Jesus is telling them this parable to basically say, it has nothing to do with what you have done. It has nothing to do with what you have given up. It has everything to do with the grace and mercy of God that has brought all people, some at the beginning, some at the end, all people to the field to work for to work for the master, to work for God. And so that's that parable. And we'll see this played out a little bit more in the rest of the chapter. And it goes directly into him going on. And he says, as Jesus was traveling up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples to the side. And notice what he says to them. He says, see, we're going up to Jerusalem and the Son of Man will be delivered. That word is also betrayed. He's saying that Judas is going to betray him. Now, he doesn't call them by name. He's just saying that he's going to be betrayed. He's going to be delivered over to the chief priests and they will condemn him to death. That's the fake trial that Jesus has. And they're going to deliver him over to the Gentiles. That's to the Romans. And these Romans are going to mock him, flog him, and crucify him. And then he will be raised on the third day. This is Jesus in really one sentence telling the disciples this prophetic verse of how he's going to die. Now, the disciples hearing this, when we get a little bit further, you're going to get to the book of Luke and we read the same story. And what's interesting is Luke tells us that Luke says that we didn't understand what Jesus was telling us. The disciples are still thinking about the Messiah being the Messiah that they grew up with, the Jewish idea of the Messiah, this political, military kingdom person that he was going to come and he was going to make him. So as they're going to Jerusalem, okay, and Jesus is saying, my time is nearing, they're thinking about, man, Jesus is going to set up his kingdom. Oh, who's going to be first? Who's going to be second? Who's going to be put in charge underneath Jesus, right? Who's going to be this? It was all about them. Once again, it's the laborers in the field, right? Who's going to get the best reward? Who's going to get the best seat? Who's going to do this? And Jesus is saying, it's not that kind of kingdom, right? It's not going to be that kind of kingdom. My kingdom is to come, right? My kingdom will be coming at a later time. We even see this thought continue on, right? We see that the mother of the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John's mom, comes to Jesus, right? And he said to her, could you do something for me? And Jesus says, what would you like? What do you want from me, mother of James and John? And she says, say that my two sons of mine, one will sit on the right, one will sit on the left. She's saying, hey, Jesus, I know you have 12 disciples, but will you make my sons, John and James, will you make them second and third in command? Right? She's doing whatever mother would do, right? Make sure my son is put up front. Make sure my son will be in charge. And then Jesus asks, you don't even know what you're asking for. He's telling the mother, you're asking for something that you have no clue what you mean. He says, are you able to drink from the cup that I drink? And James and John say, yes, Jesus, I can do whatever you can do. Once again, they're not thinking about the fake trial, the betrayal, the scolding, the crucifixion, the death. They're not thinking about that. They're thinking about the messianic kingdom coming in and saying, I want to be second in charge, right? I want to be underneath the king, right? That's what they're thinking of. And he said to them, you will drink of my cup, but to sit at my right hand and my left hand is not my choice. It's God's choice. When he says you will drink of my cup, that's not a good thing, right? We find out later in church history that James was the first martyr of all the apostles. He gave up his life for Jesus. John lived the longest. He lived the longest old life, right? So he's on the Isle of Patmos, right? So he's already been taken away. He's been put away. He's in an island by himself. And so here, Jesus already knows their future. Oh, you're going to drink of my cup, right? You're going to be tortured. You're going to be a martyr. You're going to die for my name. But who sits at left and right? That's not my will, because it's God's will, right? It's what God wants. What's funny is they hear this in verse 24, and it says the other 10 disciples heard this, and they were mad. They were mad. They heard Jesus tell him that you're going to drink from the cup. And the other disciples, once again, thought it was a good thing. They thought that he was going to be the second and the third in his messianic kingdom, that he was going to get to rule all of the world and all of Israel. And what Jesus was saying is, oh, you're going to die. You're going to die a martyr's death. Yeah, it's going to happen to you. And the other disciples were mad because they didn't get to do this, which we find out that they all do, right? They thought it was something good. But in earthly realm, it was something very bad. It's just kind of interesting to know. In verse 27, it says, whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. We all know pastors of large churches, right? We all know pastors who do a lot of work and get a lot of money in God's name. But Jesus is telling us something that is so true right here, that real ministry is for those who need the ministry. It's not for the ministers. It's not for a pastor to have 2 jets. It's not for a pastor to drive, a Rolls Royce and, have 6 mansions and jets. And it's not that, right? Ministry is to serve those who need to be served. And so Jesus himself identified it. He's saying to his disciples, once again, he identified it. And that just tells us what it is, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It's the exact same thing that we've been reading over and over again, right? So Jesus is teaching them this idea of really what the suffering servant is that Isaiah talks about, right? And so I hope this makes sense. Hope you have a better grasp on this. Man, this has been a great week. This is now the end of the 4th week. We only have 1.5 more weeks left. You guys can do it, right? We will see you on Monday in chapter 21. God bless.